Welcome back to Face the Nation. Joining us now is Mark Galli. He's editor-in-chief of the Evangelical magazine Christianity Today. He called for President Trump to be removed from office, raising questions about whether evangelical support remains rock solid. And he joins us now from Chicago. Mr. Galli, as you know, your editorial has gotten a lot of attention, and I want to highlight some of what you said here. You argue that evangelicals like yourself may like the president's platform, but you think he's grossly immoral. You described him as a near perfect example of a human being who is morally lost and confused. He's abused his authority for personal gain, betrayed his constitutional oath. Other members of the evangelical of the community, including Billy Graham, your founder's grandson or son, have denounced this.
Yeah, that would be Franklin Graham. Yeah.
Yes, Billy Graham founded, as we point out here, your publication, which is why it was so significant to have Franklin Graham rebuke you. Is the call for President Trump's removal growing?
I don't know. I mean, in one sense, my call for his removal was on the order of hyperbole in this regard. The odds of that happening either by election or a Senate are actually probably fairly slim at this point. What I'm really arguing in the piece fundamentally is that the president is unfit for office. Now, that may be a difference without a distinction without a difference. But the point is, and I'm not really speaking politically, making a political judgment about him, because that's not our expertise at Christianity Today. Mm-hmm. I am making a moral judgment that he's morally unfit, or even more precisely, it's his public morality that makes him unfit. Because all of us, anybody in leadership has, none of us are perfect. We're not looking for saints. We do have private sins, ongoing patterns of behavior that reveal themselves in our private life that we're all trying to work on. Mm-hmm. But a president has certain responsibilities as a public figure to display a certain level of public character and public morality. And the point of my argument is not to judge him as a person in the eyes of God. That's not my job. But to judge his public moral character and ask, has he gone so far that the evangelical constituency that we represent, can we in good conscience do the trade-off anymore? He gives us what we need on pro-life, but he's got this bad character. And the fundamental argument I'm making is we crossed a line somewhere in the impeachment hearings, at least in my mind, that balance no longer works. We're dealing with a person who we...
But when I raise these questions often to Republicans who consider themselves people of faith, what they say is God picks imperfect vessels, right? And the transaction here is that he is delivering on those platform issues. Is it solely the abortion policy that keeps the evangelical community cemented in their support? Because our polling shows that you, sir, are an outlier. 79% of white evangelicals say President Trump is doing a good job as president.
Yeah, I think the pro-life issue is just one of many. Religious freedom for Christians overseas especially would be another. There have been books written about what's going on with the conservative evangelical support of Trump, so that's not something we can quite get into here. It does go fairly deep. I think what I'm mostly concerned with is the fact that it's like you've mentioned a previous guest, it's the unwillingness of my brothers and sisters in Christ. I have no animus against them, mm-hmm. but it strikes me as strange that for people who take the teachings of Jesus Christ seriously, teachings of the Ten Commandments seriously, that we can't at least say publicly and out loud in front of God and everybody that this man's character is deeply, deeply concerning to us, and in my judgment, has crossed a line, and I no longer think he's fit to lead the United States of America. And I don't say that politically. I mean, our job as Christians is to love our neighbor. Right. We want the United States, everybody, left, right, black, white, of every variety of sexualities. We want them to prosper. And I'm saying that given the moral character, the public moral character of our president, that's not going to happen. It's likely to degenerate very radically over the next, mm-hmm. if it has already degenerated. and it's time for us to put a stake in the ground and say no more.
So you see the next election as sort of a referendum on the moral fiber of this country?
Well, I don't know that I would put it that way. I am saying to my evangelical brothers and sisters, take your interest in politics and put it aside for a moment, and let's start thinking about morality. And do you really think
But if
that
there's
there is
no
a
other
balance to be made?
Republican running on these platform issues, if President Trump is the only person that on these issues you have laid out is so key to your community, some Republicans just find it an impossible alternative to vote for a Democrat.
Yeah, no, I grant that. I grant that. I'm saying what I think, and about the only person I represent is me and maybe my magazine. Not for that much longer, since I'm retiring in a few days. You know, what you do about the fact that he's morally unfit, there are a lot of political options for that, and I don't really have a whole lot to say. Some are going to say work for his conviction at the Senate. Some are going to say overturn him at the election. Others are saying that's all impossible. We would need to figure out a third strategy.
Yeah.
I don't have a strategy. I'm not a political person. The questions you were asking people on your show, you guys are amazing how much stuff you know and the nuances. You guys figure that out.
Well, you are, of course, an influential voice within the evangelical community, as is your publication. So we wanted to get you to weigh in. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Our political panelists are on their way in, so don't go away. We're back with some analysis from our political panel. David Sanger is a national security correspondent and a senior writer for the New York Times. Seung Kim covers the White House from Capitol Hill for the Washington Post. Jamelle Bouie is a CBS News political analyst and a columnist with the New York Times. And Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor at the National Review and a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion. Ramesh, I want to start with you to pick up where we left off with the Christianity Today editorial. And this quandary that's laid out of judging the President of the United States as someone who should be a moral leader. Something was talked about quite a lot during the Clinton impeachment as a failing of that president. Why aren't Republicans openly talking about this? I mean, this editorial that was written caused a firestorm. I mean, it really got a lot of attention. Why is this new that it's being talked about by Republicans?
Well, in some ways, we've been talking about nothing but the president's character for 3 years now, and not just evangelicals, not just conservatives, but all of us. That, in a way, is the central issue in American politics.
Not many op-eds calling for his removal from office.
But that's right. So we now have, of course, this impeachment controversy, which has raised the stakes on the entire argument. And there's been a huge evolution in these views. Evangelicals, as late as 2011 in polling, white evangelical Christians were saying the president's character is important. A president without sound character can't be a good president. That has completely changed over time, and we're now in a situation where the parties are so polarized around this particular person. People are switching parties on the basis of whether they support this person, not on the basis of any particular view, right? We've seen that in the Congress. We've seen that with Justin Amash. We've seen that with Jeff Van Drew. Amash leaving the Republican Party, Van Drew coming to the Republican Party, just solely on the basis of what they think about President Trump. That is the #1 polarizing issue now.
Well, you know, Jamelle, Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend and 2020 candidate, talked about this a little bit, and he has incorporated more sort of discussion of morality and religion in his own campaign rhetoric. Are Democrats seeing an opportunity here? Because even Mark Galli said, I don't know what to tell people to do politically in terms of, you know, this moral quandary.
Former Vice President Joe Biden has made this kind of the central point of his campaign, that he is running to restore dignity to the White House, right? To restore a sense of normalcy, and also to get someone out who he views as immoral. And I think some Democrats, especially the more moderate candidates who are not trying to outbid each other with policy proposals, are probably going to take this line more and more. I want to make one comment about sort of the relationship between Trump and white evangelicals. I think one thing that's important to note in this conversation is not just to see change in opinion about how white evangelicals view political leadership, but, and this is detailed in a great book called The End of White Christian America by the Public Religion Research Institute's Robert Jones, that over the past 5 years, white evangelicals have come to see their position in society in battle, right? They have come to see themselves as being on the losing end of a culture war, on the losing end of a political change, of demographic change. And so in that context, President Trump may be vulgar and immoral, but he appears to be at least a defender of their perceived religious and ethnic interests. If you're going to think of white evangelicalism as being sort of like, not an ethnicity, but sort of like a national group, a kind of distinct demographic group within the country.
Seung, I mean, New York Times had a very long read on fear and loyalty in the Republican Party. And it was acknowledging that there are these sort of private conversations that I'm sure you've been part of, as have I, of dissatisfaction, but fear of speaking out. And it plays off the same idea.
It does, because you've seen what happens to the Republican officials when they do speak out. Jeff Flake, the former Arizona senator, Bob Corker, the former Tennessee senator. I mean, there is a reason why they are former United States senators, particularly for Jeff Flake, when he was one of the most vocal critics of President Trump and his conduct and his policies. His polling numbers just cratered, and he knew he could not run for re-election again as a Republican without that base of support in his party. What's going on now, the president has such a lock on his party. And you talked, I believe Patrick McHenry was also quoted in that article as saying he has this loyalty among the voters, which is why you've seen also Republican lawmakers take different political stances too on policy issues that they may not have had at other times. You've seen the Republican Party evolve on the issue of trade under Trump and Trumpism, if you will, on foreign policy. And I think a big question that we will be examining for years to come is whether Trumpism is kind of a blip on the radar of the history of the Republican Party, or if it's really fundamentally changing.
David, one of the things that's unique to Trumpism is his approach on foreign policy, in that he's been fine with breaking some China because it's necessary on this impossible challenge with North Korea. He'd take a meeting with Kim Jong-un, and virtually no other president would consider doing it, certainly none in the past. He's now at this point where his centerpiece foreign policy issue is going to be tested in the coming days. What do you know about what North Korea is planning?
Well, we don't know a whole lot about what they're planning, but we know a lot about what they've made, and we know a lot about what it is that they're saying. What they've made is probably 8 to 10 new nuclear weapons, or at least the fuel for those nuclear weapons, in the 18 months since the president had this signature trip. And by the way, the signature trip, as you and I have discussed before, was a pretty brilliant idea to have the summit between these two leaders. That had never happened before since the end of the Korean War. The problem is the president didn't prepare, and he didn't really have a plan for what he would do if Kim basically used this to play for time. And that's exactly
what has happened. And now we know that U.S. officials, they tell me, I know they tell you, they're taking this threat of ending the diplomacy seriously. They're hoping Kim Jong-un's year-end deadline isn't real.
You know, what's surprising to me is that there really isn't a plan B. I was talking to White House officials, intelligence officials for a big piece we have in the Times today, and previous presidents, George Bush, certainly President Obama, had considered plans to take out a ICBM on the pad. President Obama executed a cyber operation against North Korea's missiles before they launched. It was only partially successful at best. But I don't see a whole lot of interest in the Trump administration in doing anything other than waiting for this to happen and then going to the United Nations. Well, that's back to the same approach that the president used to complain was the failed policy of Obama, Bush, and others.
And Seung, one of the things we talked about, Senator Van Hollen, is the idea that Congress is trying to give a few more tools here. There are a lot of things tucked into that NDAA the president just signed. What else do we need to know of? Because the perception in a lot of the country is that nothing happened in U.S. Congress other than impeachment. But the president just signed a whole lot of things in the past 24 hours.
He did. If you set aside impeachment, which is very difficult to do, the president on the policy front actually had a pretty good couple of weeks. He got his long-desired Space Force, the sixth branch of the military. He accomplished a major initiative that went a lot against Republican orthodoxy, which is the paid federal or paid family leave or parental leave for federal workers. He has a massive trade deal that had the support of Democrats and got the support of the AFL-CIO on board, and it will get ratified by large margins in the Congress. But I think with all the political oxygen going towards impeachment, it is difficult for the president and his advisors to talk about his accomplishments. And you do see the president at campaign rallies and at other events try to talk up what he's done for the economy, what he's done policy front. But it all goes back to this question of impeachment. He is focused on it. He is obsessed with it. He is clamoring for that Senate trial so he could, in his view, perhaps exonerate himself. And that's going to be such a focus. And it's going to be hard for the other policy messages to break out in the next couple of weeks.
We're going to take a quick break here, and we'll take a break. Be back more with our panel. We are back now with more from our political panel. As you can hear, I've got a little bit of a Christmas cold, too. Ramesh, one of the things that got a lot of attention besides impeachment this week, and it takes a lot to break through that news cycle, is what the president said at his rally in Michigan right after the impeachment vote. When he, not for the first time, spoke ill of the dead, specifically this time John Dingell, the former congressman whose wife is a sitting congresswoman, Debbie Dingell, and he suggested that he was not in heaven looking down, but looking up from hell, and mentioned a lack of perhaps thankfulness on behalf of his widow for the fact he flew flags at half-staff following his death of the longest-serving congressman. This did get some attention, but is this another John McCain moment? I mean, has this just become understood as this is the way President Trump will continue to be?
Well, the president's supporters sometimes laud the fact that he is willing to fight. And he seems most eager to fight with people who are dead and can't fight back. And whether that marks him as a strong leader is, I suppose, going to be a matter of opinion. But one of the reasons the president's numbers have been so much worse than the strong economy would suggest is precisely because of events like this, in which he continually reveals a character that some people like, but that most Americans recoil from.
So a separate thing about that event is that President Trump said, Representative Dingell should be thankful that I flew the flags at half-mast. And that reflects, I think, something we've seen throughout this presidency, which is that the president is not able to separate himself, the person, from the office of the presidency. And so it's not that a lawmaker passes away and the country flies its flags at half-mast because of respect between mutual institutions, but that's the way we do things, but because President Trump has personally said we're going to do this.
And transactional.
And transactional, right, that he cannot seem to, and I think this plays into impeachment, right? Like he seems, in some regards, genuinely bewildered by it all. Because for him, it seems whatever he does, because he does it as the president and the presidency is merged in his person, cannot really be wrong, right? It can't be some sort of offense. And so when he's challenged on it, when he is held accountable for it, it's not a sort of, the reaction isn't, I guess I shouldn't have done that. It's a genuine kind of, what does it even mean for me to have offended anything?
And the president said just yesterday, well, what does it mean? Because now he's claiming that he wasn't actually impeached because Speaker Pelosi hasn't gone through the process of transferring the articles from the House to the Senate. You heard two Democrats explain some strategy there. What is the reality?
Well, isn't the phrase, if you're explaining, you're losing? So sometimes we've all kind of scratched our heads a little bit as to this latest tactic from Democrats, because it has been a little bit hard to explain. One of the arguments that they've given is that they're trying to exert more leverage to shape the Senate trial in terms that they find favorable, especially as McConnell has been out there saying he's in very close coordination with the White House. But McConnell and Republicans have pointed out, so you're trying to get more leverage out of us by withholding something that we don't even want anyway, so okay, go ahead. But some of the other explanations could be that they're trying to buy more time to make a public case that the Republicans are trying to do is sham trials and trying to build that public pressure on Republican senators to perhaps allow witnesses, allow the subpoenaing of documents. And also the other explanation that I've been told is to try and drive President Trump crazy in hopes of maybe driving, kind of working him up a little bit, and then maybe having Trump pressure McConnell to get the trial going right away on his, in no matter terms, because we know for some time that the president has been really looking to the Senate trial, not only for an acquittal, but an exoneration. And we've seen kind of the little pockets of irritation come out from President Trump recent days. Senator Lindsey Graham met with him on Thursday night, and he told reporters that Trump is, quote, mad as hell that Pelosi is denying him this prompt Senate trial. He complained at a rally last night that it was so unfair that Pelosi was doing this. So clearly what the speaker is doing is getting under the president's skin right now, but how that actually shapes how the Senate trial is going to be is very yet to be seen.
David, we heard from kind of not someone you would expect as a defender of the president in terms of helpful messaging, but Vladimir Putin himself at a year-end press conference echoed a lot of the very same talking points that Republicans say when it comes to characterizing this entire basis of impeachment. This is about Democrats trying to overturn the 2016 election, that this is all a political sham.
The most remarkable part about this was the president then tweeted out Vladimir Putin's statement on his own Twitter feed, right? When was the last time you saw a president seeking the endorsement of an authoritarian running a country that is the most significant adversary to the United States?
Who he's suggested and alleged to have ever, to have some odd relationship with. He seems to endorse it by, again, tweeting it.
That's absolutely right. And then at the same time, opposing in a 22-page letter a bill that's going through the Senate right now, sponsored by Lindsey Graham, that would put additional sanctions on Russia. So even in the midst of impeachment, they were tone deaf enough to basically oppose further sanctions. And this may get to the authoritarian issue that you were discussing, because if the president's having a hard time separating himself from the office, it may be in part because the leaders around the world that he admires the most don't separate themselves from the office, right? Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Erdogan of Turkey, who he talks to a lot. All of them, the word of the president is basically goes unchallenged or you face a significant penalty. And that's pretty remarkable, and it tells you a lot about how the president envisions the job. And to many people, their concern is what happens if he then survives this and use that more.
That's a topic for a whole other panel. We're going to have to leave it there, David, and we will be right back. That's it for us. Thank you for watching, and we want to wish our viewers happy Hanukkah, which starts tonight, and a very Merry Christmas. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.